Hello, everyone. Welcome to Feedstuffs 365. I'm Sarah Muirhead. Joining us today is Dr. Al Kertz, and our topic is whether growth and body composition of calves fed only milk replacer or whole milk. So welcome, Al. Thank you for joining us here today.
It's good to be back for another month. I'll give you a little preview. Next month is going to be the 25th anniversary of when I started writing columns for Feedstuffs. And that particular one will be larger than normal, not because of that, but just the way it is. It'll follow this study, and I'll give you a little reason why when we get to the end of it. But this one's about
Al,
calves.
I think we started working together 25 years ago.
Absolutely did.
I think we were there when you started. So before we get into our discussion, just want to remind the audience they can post any questions they have for you there in the chat. So go ahead, Al, and let's dig into today's topic.
Well, the title includes a milk replacer, and sometimes I cringe a little bit about that title because a milk replacer really can't replace whole milk because there's some bioactive compounds. It doesn't have the same fatty acid composition, doesn't have the same protein sources and the like. So this is like maybe splitting hairs, but I think of it more as a milk substitute because milk isn't available or it's not as economical to feed as a milk replacer. But that's a little background. But previously, I had reported on one of the studies from the University of Illinois, the same graduate student. And this one, and that one used 3 different levels of milk replacer feeding. This one looks at it a bit differently. And it used male Holstein calves that were sourced from a local dealer in the Illinois, University of Illinois area. They were brought in at about a week of age. And I've got several paragraphs of protocol. I'm not going to go through it in detail. I copied it from the paper so that if you're looking at this particular study, you don't have to go back to the Journal of Dairy Science and find the original study or whatever journal it's in. So I'm just going to skim through some of those pieces of information. There were actually 3 treatments. There was a typical milk replacer, like a 22 protein, 20 fat. And then there was a higher fat one, which would be closer to protein and fat to whole milk. And then the third treatment was whole milk. But since they were looking at body composition, there's a baseline of these calves. I think there were 74 of them they started with. There was a baseline of those that were slaughtered so that they could measure their body composition as a starting point. And then at various intervals, they slaughtered the rest of them. And they also had different feeding levels as a percent of body weight. And at the end, in one of the tables, we'll see where that sometimes creates a little bit of an odd situation where you're calculating how much you're going to feed the calves next week based on how much they ate this week. So if they keep eating more, you keep feeding more the following week, and that may get you out of balance. Because what they were trying to do in this study was keep the focus strictly on the liquids. So there was no calf starter fed, and water was available for your choice. And they tried to keep the protein and the energy similar among these 3 treatments so that that alone would not be a factor in any difference in body composition. And then they went out to, I think it was about 35 days when they did the last slaughter. So again, this is done for experimental purposes. It's not something you do practically, but there's a limited amount of data on body composition of calves and even less on heifers. And that's the study I'll review next week, because I think it's the only real study with Holstein heifers. So let's take a look then at what we have in this study. If we look at the first table, we've got the composition. The milk replacer the first column you see was at 25, 30. It was supposed to be about a 22. And of course, you can have variation in what the composition says on the tag versus what it is. And that composition can vary because of sampling variability, assay variability, and maybe even the ingredients are variable, even though they have the same percentage of ingredients. So you're always going to have some variation there. So it's 21 fat. This is on a dry basis, 21 fat and 25 protein. You see the lactose is 49%, almost 50%. And that was one of the things they were looking at in this study, because there's some question as to whether calves have a limit or there's a sweet spot in a way for how much lactose they can handle. Now, if we go across the line, we see that the high fat milk replacer had 27% fat and whole milk had 27%. And both of them had 25 point something protein. So the high fat milk replacer was very close to whole milk and fat and protein levels. And also in lactose, a little bit higher, a bit lower in ash or mineral than the other two. And again, that's going to depend on what kind of ingredients were used in making the milk replacer. If it's delactose whey, you have a different mineral composition than if it's a regular whey. And then you see the growth energy, and that would be a little bit higher on the high fat milk replacer and the whole milk because they have higher fat. And then the ratio of crude protein and metabolizable energy, same thing. The high fat milk replacer and whole milk had a bit higher ratio of that. Now let's look at table 2. And if we look at the dry matter intake, the milk replacer 1.74 versus 157 and 151. And this is a case where what I talked about earlier occurred, where every week you recalculate as a percent of body weight how much you're going to feed the following week. Well, the milk replacer, the regular milk replacer, as you remember, had less fat. And so what seemed to happen was those calves ate a bit more of it because it had less fat, less energy. So then they'd feed a bit more the next week and so on. So that's the reason it looks like this particular treatment was 1.74 pounds versus about 157, 151 on the other one. Protein intake was similar, although the whole milk for some reason about 0.35, a little bit lower. Lactose was greater consumption with the milk replacer. Remember, it had 49% lactose, and the other two were about 40%. Total fatty acids a bit higher on the second two because they had a higher percentage of fat to start with. Gross energy, you see it's lower on the regular milk replacer because it's lower in fat. And then metabolizable energy, the same thing, was lower because of that. So now let's look at table 3. And now we're going to look at some of the body weights. Initial body weights were similar among the 3 treatments, a little bit lower on milk replacer, and high fat milk replacer was higher. If you use a covariate adjustment on starting body weight, then that takes out that difference that you start with. The total body weight, the final body weight, was a bit higher on the regular milk replacer. But again, remember, they were eating more because they had lower fat, so they were fed more. And so their final body weight was a bit higher, and their average daily gain was a bit higher, 1.5 versus about 1.2 to 1.26. The heart girth was a bit more on the milk replacer versus high fat milk replacer. None of these differences were significant because there's a lot of variation there. The body length, again, no real differences. A little bit shorter on the whole milk treatment. But remember, those calves only average 100 pounds instead of 104.6 versus the high fat milk replacer. Withers height, that's the one I most relate to, 32.9, 32.8, 33.5. So again, similar, a little higher in whole milk. And then gain to feed ratio was better for the high fat milk replacer and whole milk than it was for the regular milk replacer. And again, that's probably because on regular milk replacer, the calves ate a bit more. They gained a bit more, but they ate more than they gained as a difference. And so that's why you see that difference. No real difference on the fecal score. Days with fecal scores greater than 24 in their system. A bit higher on the high fat milk replacer. And so there was some difference there, but not a great difference. Now let's take a look at the last table, table 4, the body composition. If you may recall, there's a couple principles we have to keep in mind when we're talking about body composition. The first one is there's an inverse relationship between the body fat and the water content. And that's why sometimes if you're on a human diet, you may be losing body fat and not losing weight, and then all of a sudden there's a loss in weight. Sometimes that's due to the you're losing fat and it's being replaced by water, and then your body readjusts its water content, and it looks like all of a sudden you lost a chunk. Well, it was happening all along. It just wasn't evident because we don't slaughter humans to measure body composition. It's not something we do. So if we look at the data here, the water content was about 71% across the board. And that's as high as it'll be, because if we look at the fat percentage, it was almost 7% on the regular milk replacer versus 6.6 and 6.6 on the other two. So that's that inverse relationship. So the fat percentages were similar, and so the water content is going to be similar. Now, if you look at the protein, you see they were also similar, a little bit higher on the high fat milk replacer. And the ash, that mineral content of the carcass, was very similar and low. And the energy content was very similar. So they were able to very effectively manage the feeding so that they got similar amount of protein and energy, and so you got similar body composition. Now, I want to cover a little bit about what there were some other data that don't show on the table. For instance, blood values. They were taken as various intervals, and there was some difference in blood urea nitrogen. It tended to be higher with the whole milk and the high fat milk replacer. Retained body energy were different in that the whole milk and high fat milk replacer had more energy because it had a bit more fat content in the diet and in their body composition, but no differences in efficiencies of utilization of protein. And I think the authors had some good key comments, so I'm going to just skim through that a little bit. Despite similar intakes, milk in metabolizer energy and protein, the higher lactose diet, which was the milk replacer, which had lower fat, and that's the reason there was higher lactose, actually had a greater daily gain, which by protocol led to more milk replacer being fed, which is I've discussed. And so What it showed that in this particular trial, up to almost 50% lactose was not a problem. And in fact, it may be a bit more effective in gaining body composition protein than the higher fat was. And then they had another comment as well about, let's see, that the results of this study are consistent with the hypothesis that dietary lactose promotes greater growth of lean body tissue than dietary fat in young dairy calves. So that's, of course, only in young dairy calves because that's the animals that were used in this study. And the dietary protein was very similar in how it was utilized for lean body tissue. So this is another key study, and I think some of this data is probably used in the 2021 NASM, which replaced the 2001 dairy NRC, as Jim Drakely was involved in that, revising that young calf model from 2001 to 2021, and he had access to these data as well.
Very good. A reminder to post any questions that you might have for Dr. Kertz. They are in your chat. Also, if you're looking to dig into the column and some of these tables and charts that Al presented, you can find a link there in the chat that will take you to that. So, Dr. Kertz, what would you say then is the bottom line in all of this?
Well, the bottom line was that up to 50% lactose in the milk replacer was not a negative factor, and that's been something that's been debated. And I think this study shows it still promotes very effectively lean body growth. But now the other thing to remember about this particular study, it's a very good research trial, but there was no starter fed, so it's not a practical way of feeding calves on a dairy, but it does address some of these points about body composition and the higher lactose content being viable in milk replacers.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your insight with us here today. And as you said, we're going to be back with you next month for another update. I don't know if you want to plug that one more time, what we're going to be talking about next month.
I'm going to be talking about a Holstein heifer body composition growth study. It's the only one really that's been done. And I'm going to go back to my thesis work at Cornell, which was over 50 years ago, because they both relate to each other in a way that's very helpful in understanding this whole area. So hang on to your hats.
We look forward to that. Thank you, Al. We see you then. Likewise, we appreciate all of you joining in. A reminder that all Feedstuffs 365 sessions are available in on-demand format on feedstuffs.com. Until next time, for Feedstuffs, I'm Sarah Muirhead.